3 elections produced no clear winner. Now the Israelis go to the polls yet again. The hope is to end the deadlock that's gripped the country. So could this vote make a difference? And what will it mean for Benjamin Netanyahu? This is Inside Story. Hi there, welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vinell. Israel's 4th round of elections in less than 2 years is aimed at ending its prolonged political crisis. But opinion polls suggest the vote could yield inconclusive results yet again and lead to coalition governments that could soon collapse. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is again at the forefront of the elections. He's already been in power for 12 consecutive years. Netanyahu believes he and his right-wing allies can get an edge this time and lead the government for a 6th term. He's being challenged by a fractured group of political contenders. Harry Fawcett sets up our discussion with this report.
In 3 consecutive elections, Benny Gantz presented the strongest challenge Benjamin Netanyahu had faced in years. The former army chief headed the Blue and White Alliance, helping deny Netanyahu a viable coalition, but failing to form one of his own. His decision last year to split his alliance and break his central campaign promise by joining Netanyahu in government has seen his standing crumble.
We entered the government despite Netanyahu, not for Netanyahu. We entered the government because there was a health, economic and social crisis, one of the biggest Israel has ever seen. And we are not outsiders. All of us are soldiers for this country.
Now he's campaigning for perhaps half a dozen seats on the basis that they can block legislation allowing Netanyahu to escape his corruption trial. Gantz's collapse has left a fragmented field of possible alternatives to Netanyahu. Leading the pack is Yair Lapid, Gantz's former partner in Blue and White, a former finance minister in an earlier Netanyahu government, and now the #1 target of Netanyahu's campaign.
Netanyahu by now, he didn't start this way, by now he's a complete cynic. And he sees this as the tool of diverting us from the things he doesn't want us to talk about.
Lapid has tried to downplay his own prime ministerial ambitions, wary of Netanyahu's attempts to cast the election as a 2-horse race in which Lapid becomes the scary left-winger. Gideon Rahad of the Israel Democracy Institute says a split field makes it more difficult for the prime minister.
Netanyahu would like us to choose between 2 good chocolates, but you have to face many good chocolates, let's say it. And if you think about the voter as a consumer, this is much more problematic for him.
In the unlikely chocolate box of Israeli politics, Naftali Bennett would be found well to the right of the prime minister. He rules out working with Lapid, but leaves the door to joining Netanyahu at least partially open. Not so Gideon Sa'ar.
The painful truth is that Netanyahu prefers his own personal interests over the interests of the country.
His decision to leave Netanyahu's Likud and challenge him from the right at the head of his New Hope party was the big news as the campaign began. But his promised late surge in the polls has failed to happen. For all that's changed in terms of the lineup of challenges, one thing has remained constant throughout this 2-year political crisis. It really is all about Benjamin Netanyahu. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, West Jerusalem.
Let's bring in our guests. In West Jerusalem, we have Gil Hoffman, Chief Political Correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. In London, we have Yossi Mekelberg, Senior Consulting Research Fellow at Chatham House. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera's Inside Story. I'd like to begin with you, Gil, and take that statement posed by our correspondent, turn it into a question. Are these elections really now just about Benjamin Netanyahu?
Unfortunately, yeah. I would have loved it if this election would be about serious issues like the economy and matters of religion and state and where Israel's final border should be in negotiations with the Palestinians that are inevitable to take place under Joe Biden. But no, they're about the person who is our prime minister now, longer than any prime minister in Israel's history, who is a divisive figure who people either love or hate. And as long as you have a majority of people in Israel who agree with Netanyahu's policies, but a majority of people in Israel who don't want Netanyahu to remain in office, especially under criminal indictment, we seem doomed to continue with political chaos.
So, Gil, is that the only factor at play here? Explain to our international audience, if you can, how the country got to this point of it all just being about Netanyahu.
Well, we were supposed to have a government that would last 4 years. And instead, Netanyahu initiated an early election back at the end of 2018 that took place in April 2019. And then no government could be formed a couple times. Then a government could be formed that only lasted a year. And that's what's led to us proving Einstein's theory of insanity, of doing the same thing over and over and over and over again and expecting a different result.
Yossi Mekelberg, will there be a different result?
Well, I don't think we can expect diametrically opposite results. I think in Israel, to a large extent, you look at the margins, because we are talking about two blocks. And it's not even between right and left anymore. It's between anyone but Bibi or the one only Bibi. And this was left. And I fully agree with Gil about his analysis that here it's almost a referendum about Netanyahu. But when we say referendum on Netanyahu, is Netanyahu the person, the way he handles himself as a prime minister, but at the same time also his record, the very things that were mentioned just before, the relation with the Palestinians, the issues, the economic issue, the way or the failed manner in which coronavirus has been dealt in Israel. But it's at the end of the day, it's for the electorate. As I said, if in 4 elections, 3 already, they voted exactly or very similarly, the pattern is so similar, how would they expect to get different results? We'll see. But the most important thing is to look by the end of tomorrow whether there is any shift in the blocks. And the blocks, again, not necessarily ideological, but more those who want to see the end of the Netanyahu era and those who will still try to keep him in power.
Gil Hoffman, what do you think is Netanyahu's calculation here? I mean, obviously, he's hoping that a greater majority will give him more power. But what would that mean for his fighting the corruption charges that he's facing?
So Netanyahu's trial has finally started after being pushed off and pushed off. And there's no doubt that it's easier in any country if you are in power when you go to trial and not be an average citizen. If we keep on going to elections by Israeli law, the caretaker government in between the elections is still led by the prime minister. And it's technically possible that a deal reached with Benny Gantz ahead of the last election, the alternate prime minister, could result in him taking power. But right now, Netanyahu has a legal interest in staying in power as long as he can. And his other calculation, if you use that word, is over here, the vaccines. We've had 4,500,000 Israelis vaccinated in a country of 9 million people, of which a third are under 16 and too young to be vaccinated. So we're leading the world in vaccinations, and Netanyahu is counting on the people of Israel to thank him for that and to feel that right shoulder when they go to vote.
We can now bring in Akiva Eldar, who is in Tel Aviv, political analyst. Akiva Eldar, I want to put the same question to you. Do you think that this deadlock and repeated elections has shaped the way that voters in Israel will vote now? Is it in any way about policies for the voter?
I think it's more about love affair with Netanyahu or hate affair with Netanyahu. It's all about one person. If you remove Netanyahu, the person Netanyahu, from the equation, first of all, we wouldn't have the 4th elections, and I'm not sure if this is the last one this year. It's people cannot be indifferent to Netanyahu. They don't talk about occupation. They don't talk about the economy. Yes, some people are grateful that he brought the vaccines, but there are many people who lost their jobs or lost their relatives due to his problematic, I would say mildly, in regard to the COVID-19. And some people are really fed up, and they will stay at home or go to the beach. It's getting very warm here and nice outside. And many young people believe that it's going to be business as usual. Why the fourth time will be different from the third, second, or the first time? My granddaughter is just turned 19, and this is the third time that she is going to visit the balloting station, and I have to work very hard to convince her to take the effort.
Yossi Mekelberg, I'd like to come back to you. What is the impact of having all of these elections?
Well, it's created constant instability in Israel, the inability for the country to move away from the Netanyahu era, to take different take, to actually think strategically on so many important issues. Israel is so preoccupied with Netanyahu for the last 4 years. He's been under investigation. And all the thing we're discussing is whether Netanyahu stays or goes, and whether, as Akiva says, the people are in love with him or not. Half, are in love with him, and the other half wants really to see him go. But at the same time, there are dire consequences, economic consequences of COVID need to be addressed. The highest unemployment level ever. There is obviously the issue of the occupation and the need to resolve one and for all in a peaceful manner based on two-state solution, the relation with the Palestinians, Iran, and so many other issues. But at the same time, the Netanyahu issue compromised the ability of Israel to actually to address any serious issue that is of concern for the citizen. And this can't be healthy for any state.
Gil Hoffman, talk me through who Netanyahu's main challenges are, what they bring to the table, and how much of a threat they really pose.
Well, it would have been a lot harder for Netanyahu if it would end up that his main competitor in this race would be a challenger on the right. And for a while, it looked like there would be a main challenger on the right. His former protege, his former chief of staff, Naftali Bennett, built up credit with the people of Israel when he focused on the coronavirus in a very professional way, first as defense minister, then as a member of the opposition. But then he lost half of his support. And then came along a Likud Knesset member named Gideon Sa'ar, who was a former education and interior minister. And for a while, he was the main challenger. And now he's lost more than half of his support that he had when this election was called. And that's left Yair Lapid, who's a centrist, who's a former journalist, anchorman, who is a former finance minister, but coming from the center and from Netanyahu's perspective, center-left, he makes him a very easy competitor against Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, for so many decades in politics, has tried to make left-wing a bad word to the citizens of Israel, and it's pretty easy to do that with Lapid. For Netanyahu to be defeated, you would have to have a strong partnership of Lapid, Sa'ar, and Bennett together, and it remains to be seen whether that's possible.
Akiva, Eldar, what does all of this political deadlock, I guess is the word, mean for the smaller parties, including for the Arab parties? Might they end up being the make or break for future coalitions?
I think that what happens is that even before we open the balloting stations, we can say that all the parties are losing because people don't believe in the system. Arabs and Jews are really losing their belief, their trust in democracy. They see that it's business as usual. They get used to the idea that a person who is indicted in very severe charges can get the mandate for the fourth time, probably. Well, he got it the previous times. Why not the fourth time? Can get it from the president of Israel. People even say that he may make a deal with Sa'ar and others and get their support in voting for him to be the next president, since President Rivlin will finish his term in July. I think that the fact that Netanyahu can convince Israeli Arabs, whom he has delegitimized for so many years, to support him, I think that this is another slap in the face of the average Israeli Arab and tell him that we believe that we can tell you again and again that someone who doesn't believe in coexistence with the Israeli Arabs can be your leader. So I think that all the parties, including the Orthodox who have lost trust because of their conduct during the COVID-19 crisis, I think the Likud is losing because Gideon Sa'ar, Benny Begin and others left the party. So we are not voting for political parties. It's either you vote for the person, for Mr. Netanyahu or Mr. Lapid, and it's not about issues.
Yeah, I want to bring in Yossi Mekelberg on this point. Why has the left been unable to provide a credible alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, I think we need to look at it historically, and I think the Labour Party was in the decline from 1977, not even from post-Rabin era. I think they lost their natural vote electoral for many years, and they became a very Tel Avivian, if you like, party which appealed instead of the working classes and the underprivileged within the society. They actually appealed to the middle class and upper middle classes in Tel Aviv and the intelligentsia, and that's where they felt their comfort zone, and as a result, between the Labour Party and Meretz, they are going to compete basically for pittance instead of actually having the ability to reach out to the wider population that you would expect they will represent. I think the tragedy of the left in Israel is on two levels. The socio-economic one, that Netanyahu, though he has done nothing for the working classes and the underprivileged in Israel society, they see him as their representative. And also, I think their lack of courage to set a real alternative when it comes to the relation with the Palestinians. The fact that even the Labour Party is not ready to talk about occupation, use the word occupation during this election, so that they lost their way. They are not ready to really present an alternative, a true alternative, and also to be patient by presenting this alternative to fight not only this election, but the next and the other election, until they create this kind of credibility among the wider population. The more and more became a niche party that appeals to very few people in Israel.
Okay, Gil Hoffman, we haven't even mentioned Benny Gantz. I mean, he was meant to be coming in as Prime Minister in the rotating Prime Ministership. Is this election going to be the last we hear of him?
I interviewed Benny Gantz on Thursday, and I found him to be confident and ready, very frustrated with what he had been through over the previous year and a half in Israeli politics. He found the army to be a lot more pleasant situation. He said in the army, when you kill your opponents, they don't come back. But in Israeli politics, they do. Benny Gantz will be a component of the anti-Netanyahu camp that aims to bring him down. And I want to be a little bit more optimistic than both of the other speakers here. First of all, I want to differ with Yossi on the Labour Party. Mirav Michaeli, the new Labour chairwoman, is reviving the party. She's doing what Jesus did in reviving the dead, and it's been very impressive to see this old party get new life. And I want to differ with Akiva when it comes to Israeli Arabs. There's been a fascinating change among Israeli Arabs. Mansour Abbas, the leader of the United Arab List party, wants to cooperate with the Israeli government, no matter where it is on the political spectrum, in order to help the Israeli Arab citizens. For decades, Israeli Arab parties said, no, we have to wait for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to be solved. But when you had the Abraham Accords and they saw the UAE and Bahrain aren't waiting for the Palestinian conflict to be solved, then the Israeli citizens of Israel don't have to wait either. And it could very well be that Abbas will be the kingmaker in this election, and this will result in the infrastructure and the education systems finally being improved in that Arab sector and them being the big winners of this race.
Akiva, Eldar, do Palestinians care about the Israeli elections?
I think that the average Israeli will rather spend his time tomorrow on the beach than standing in line in the balloting stations. People just don't care so much anymore. I will offer you a dialogue I heard the other day between two Israelis in the supermarket. One said, who else do you have? Do you have any other candidate? As was mentioned before, do you have an alternative? The other guy said, but what happens if Netanyahu is now 71, going on 72? What happens if he's gone? We had great prime ministers like Ben-Gurion, like Menachem Begin, who passed away, and there was a replacement. The cemeteries are full of leaders who were irreplaceable. So the guy said, I couldn't believe it. He said, well, so his son will succeed him. So as I mentioned before, and he was serious about it.
Okay.
It went on, the discussion.
I want to come back and ask you again.
Becoming a kind of a monarchy.
What about Palestinians? Do Palestinians care about the Israeli elections?
The Palestinians lost completely their hope in a change. And I'll add to the discussion the American elections. They were hoping to hear something from the new American president, Biden. Previously, actually, this is the first time in the last 4 elections that Netanyahu doesn't have his American friend on his side to support him with moving an embassy or approving annexation. Now he is on his own. And if you read the American response to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, about the indicting or investigation, the Israeli criminal war offenses, you will see that Biden offered Netanyahu the full support. I didn't hear that he allowed the Palestinians to reopen their embassy in Washington. Mm-hmm. So I think they lost not only hope in Israel, they lost hope in the Arab world. You see what's happening in the Gulf countries, that they welcome Israelis. The Gulf became, Dubai is the most popular tourist attractions for the Israelis. Israelis go there.
Okay, I want to. We are coming to the end of time. I want to bring in Yossi Mekelberg. I think everyone seems to be on agreement that the Palestinian issue doesn't seem to be a factor in these elections. Why is that? Is it because voters have already got their entrenched positions where they stand about the illegal occupation of Palestinian territories, how they feel about human rights, or is it that it's just simply not being talked about?
I think there are multiple reasons for this. And, one of so-called successes of Netanyahu and his allies is the ability to marginalize the issue. And the Israeli society lives in complete denial about the fact that they deprive a nation of their rights for self-determination and the consequences of an entrenched occupation that deprive people of their basic human rights. So this is one thing. At the same time, the international community shows very little interest in what's happening in Palestine and the current situation. Settlements are expanding. The Jewish population in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, is growing. We saw how the military treats civilian population, now the settlers, and the international community does basically nothing, with the exception, for instance, now the ICC. If you add to this that there is a sense that also the region itself gave up on the Palestinians, and the divisions among the Palestinians themselves, the inability to find common ground between the Hamas and the Fatah, the West Bank and Gaza, there is a real issue here. But whatever happens, the Israelis are going to be affected by what happened among the Palestinians and vice versa.
Of course, whatever happens in Israel...
This situation is not going away.
Absolutely.
And it needs a peaceful solution.
We are going to have to leave it there for time. My apologies. Thank you very much to all of our guests for joining us here on Inside Story. Akiva, Eldar, Gil Hoffman and Yossi Mekelberg. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Kim Vinell, and the whole team here, bye-bye for now.